how would you describe your podcast to somebody that's never heard of it before? So I'd love to throw that first question off to you all. Who would like to answer first?
I can start.
Awesome, let's do it.
Hi, my name is Adriana Flores Agade, and I am the host and founder of Latinx America. And Latinx America my mission is to change our narrative, the narrative for our community, one story at a time. And podcasting is my medium. So my podcast is about highlighting people in tech. So techies, innovators, founders, and investors. And I highlight personal and professional journeys because I know that for our community, it's really important to have that personal connection as well as the professional path to get to. So how would I describe my podcast to someone? It's inspirational stories of real people with an action plan.
Awesome. Thank you. Jose, would you mind, can I have you go next?
Yes, of course. So my name is Jose Formoso, and I am the host and creator of the Techqueria podcast, which is the podcast that connects to the Techqueria.org community. And I'm very grateful and excited to be able to share it with everybody. The Techqueria podcast is a podcast not just for the community, but it's about the community, about the things that the community cares about, thinks about, is concerned about, and where it's going to go in the future. We talk to a lot of the people that are in the technology industry, but the technology industry is everywhere. It has its fingers in every part of the world, from government to everything, really, to the environment. So we're going to talk about to a lot of different types of people in a lot of different ways with a lot of contextualizing journalism style that because I've been a journalist for 15 years. So that's kind of my background, and that's what I bring to this podcast.
Awesome.
I assume I go next.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Odalis Jasmine. You can call me either or, Odalis or Jasmine, and I will respond to you. I am the host and creator of the Hella Latino podcast, Hella Latina, however you want to say that. I give you a lot of options. My podcast, the mission of it is to amplify our community's voices, amplify first generation stories about what it's like to either move from the country of origin in Latin America to being a daughter or a son of a first generation or of an immigrant, and talking about the complexities of identity and navigating Latinidad in the United States. A lot of just real stories from our community and representing all of what is Latino America, from the Caribbean to South America to Central America to Mexico. But for someone who's never heard of it, who's never listened to any podcast or my podcast, it's really like a cafe. I always say this, cafecito and chisme session. It's literally two people talking about these things that we go through, these first generation experiences, and it's like you're like listening in on the chisme, and it's really, that's the kind of vibe that I set for every episode.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'd like to do a quick introduction myself. Hello, everybody. Michael Urbina. Very nice to meet you all. I'm the podcast for Adelante Juntos, and our podcast is about highlighting and essentially disseminating the stories, professional advice, executives, that there's just a small percentage of Latino executives in Silicon Valley and beyond. So my objective is to capture those stories and essentially to disseminate that information, to share those stories of professional journeys and advice with early in career talent that identifies as Latinx or Hispanic. So that's essentially what the goal is. Thank you so much to all my panelists. I'm very excited. I've spoken with all of you individually. I've listened to your podcasts. I'm sure people joining have heard your podcast as well, and they're all excited that we're having this session. I'd love to first and foremost pose a question to all of you. And Odalis, I'd love to start with you if that's okay. What was the catalyst for you deciding to create your podcast?
Oh man. So in my first actual episode of the podcast, it's actually me explaining why I'm creating it, and it goes back to my story. For me, it was I grew up in San Diego. I grew up in a low income area, and I was probably like a minority compared to my other Latino peers. I was Honduran American, Hondureña, Catracha, in a predominantly Mexican culture. So for me, I always kind of felt like, where are all the Hondureños at? You know, like the only ones I know is my family. And even in the media, there wasn't a lot of representation of Latinas, you know, who I wanted to be like. So I wanted just to kind of create this representation for other people, other Latinos who might have felt just misrepresented in different ways, right? And so it goes back to a lot of things. I went through a lot of first gen experiences similar to a lot of people in the first gen experience shoes. You know, like there's a lot of really, really unique experiences that we go through, whether it's applying for college for the first time, or it's moving out of the low income area, or building something of your own, or, you know, trying to give back to your parents. There's a lot of very, very similar things that we go through, but it's also, I wanted to create that representation for Hondurans, for other Central Americans, and same, I wanted to create that representation for other people. And I think my podcast, everyone, especially Latinos, people of color, you know, any community that's underrepresented, needs spaces where they feel heard and they feel seen. And that's really what my platform, what this podcast is.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Adriana and Jose, I'd also love to pose you the same question. Whoever would like to go first, what was for you deciding to create your podcast?
You want to go, Adriana?
No, I'll let the men go first.
Thank you very much. The catalyst for me was that I've been a journalist for the last 10, 12, 13 years. And I worked at technology publications. And while I learned a lot at those publications, there was very little diversity. And I remember, for those that heard the first episode of the Techqueria podcast, I explained a little bit that when I first walked into the Wired.com newsroom, which is, you know, an exalted place, a lot of people read that publication, and I met a lot of really cool people there. It was about 95% male whites, right? So it was very non-diverse, and again, I learned a lot of stuff there. But even when you're a journalist, you have the opportunity to take on different beats. So whether you're in politics or in technology or anything like that, but the people that consist of journalism groups make up a lot of the choices. So even though the news happens and you need to either cover presidential election, or you need to cover, you know, the latest, the quarterly reports of Netflix or something like that, that job has to be done. But outside of the things that need to be covered, there's a lot of options and choices that journalists need to do and need to, you know, the stories that they need to take on. And because there was very little diversity, you never heard about any Latinos, any, you know, Latinx people in the technology industry at all, even though, excuse me, there were tons of people that have been creating companies. Say, like in my beat was technology and software and hardware. There were tons of people that were CEOs and they were creators, or that were part of the engineering team, et cetera, et cetera. And there were never any profiles of Latino or Latinas. So over the years, I kind of got tired of that. And even though I kind of gained, you know, some power, I guess, at least a little bit in my little tiny corner of the world as a reporter and a blogger, the people that made the choices at the very top, the executive editors, would often put down the ideas for Latino profiles, even though some people were incredible and they had incredible stories. So ultimately, I wanted to create a podcast about Latino people that had a technology connection. And about a year ago, I found out about Techqueria.org, and I was blown away. I thought this is such an incredible community of the type of people that I want to talk to. I want to tell their stories. So I I got in touch with Francis Cornell and David Silva and everybody that's part of the Techqueria.org executive team. And I said, let's do this together. Let's bring some amazing stories from the community, by the community, that can go outside of the community, that people that are not even Latino could see, and they could see how big a part we are of this community that is really making a difference all over the world. So I think we've done that, and we finally launched 2 months ago, and we're excited to move forward.
Thank you, Jose. Now I'll go. So the reason why I launched the podcast is because I've been in education for a very long time. That's my background in education, nonprofit, and then I joined the media world. And as Jose mentioned, there are only like 2 to 5 minute stories that you can put out there. So I felt that podcasting was a way to really get our stories out into the community. And I've been in Silicon Valley for 20 years, married to an engineer, and I gauge diversity numbers based on how many people are going to the Christmas party, and that hasn't changed very much. We've had an uptick, but it hasn't changed. So I want the kids from East Palo Alto and Redwood City and our surrounding area to also be part of this ecosystem. And by showcasing stories of real people that maybe had very similar backgrounds as themselves, you're able to show people the way, inspire them, and help them achieve more. So that's really why I started. I wanted to make a difference one story at a time, and I'm very grateful to all of the people that have lent their stories, such as Francis Coronel, that are making a difference, and they're becoming role models and leaders in our community. So I'm just very grateful to be able to do this.
Thank you. Sincerely appreciate all of your insights. I can only speak to just my experience with Adelante, and the reason why I created it is because the day job, I'm an executive recruiter, and most of the 96% of the time, I'm the only person of color in the room, given that a lot of executives are white males. So that's one of the catalysts. That was the catalyst for me wanting to create my podcast, is that I don't see any Latinx leaders that look like me. So for me, that was why I decided, you know what? I have this existing network. Why don't I reach out and see if they're open, and basically just corral all these stories and have it in one place. So I'm sure that we all, can attest to, just how powerful it is to be able to see your story represented in a podcast, in a video, and in a song. So it's just great that we're all, doing this work in different respects with different communities while still focusing on the Latinx identity. I'd love to pose you all another question. And that is more so on how you go about creating your podcast schedule. And Adriana, I'd love to start with you, if that's okay. How do you decide who you want to interview on the podcast? What's your strategy there? And then Jose, I'd love to pose it to you, and then Odalis afterwards as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, everyone's story and everyone's journey is extremely important. So when I started the podcast over 2.5 years ago, I was leveraging my network and trying to find stories that would have, that capture someone's attention. And so I leveraged that network. Nowadays, I'm very fortunate to have grown that network, and now actually I have people that are approaching me. So I'm pretty much done recording weekly episodes until the end of the year, because all of the stories have been captured, and now I'm focusing on producing. And but I really go for people. I'm not necessarily focused on title. I'm interested in people's stories, because one of the most powerful stories that I was able to capture was of Esme Martinez, and she was at Airbnb. She went from having a job working at a coffee shop, minimum wage, and yogurt land, minimum wage. Within a few years after moving to Silicon Valley and working with mission development, she was able to hone up her tech skills and land her first salary job, where she was making a big salary, and it changed the trajectory of her life. So for me, it's not so much a title, it's about the powerful stories that will inspire others to understand and know how to get from point A to point B and to be inspired. So network, if actually I'm recruiting right now for season 4. So if anyone is interested in sharing their story, I will put a link to a Google form that I have, but I've also now been approached by different PR firms that are trying to get their execs on the podcast, which is kind of nice to know that the people are really interested in getting on the show. But for me, it's more about the story, the individual, and the impact that story is going to have once you listen to it.
Awesome, thank you, Jose. What are your thoughts? How do you decide who to have on the podcast?
It took us a long time to really figure out how we were going to do it, because there's so many ways to do it. What we thought was most useful to people was to think about a topic and something that people were like, again, people in the Latinx community at large and the Techqueria community specifically, something that they were caring about, and that more like themes. So for example, for the upcoming episode that's coming out this weekend, we wanted to talk about Afro-Latinidad, right? And how Black people in the Latinx community are thinking about what's happened this year, right, with Black Lives Matter, and how it's a little bit different when it comes to, maybe sometimes it's a lot different when it comes to Latinos, and how a lot of Black people in the Latino community are also discriminated against, and how do they feel when they live in the United States with people that are that see themselves as just African American and not Latino. So anyway, so that was the main idea, and I was thinking about, who can I talk to that can best represent that idea and that theme. And I found somebody through the Techqueria Community. His name is Matthew Sayas, and he lives over in Buffalo, New York. And so I had that conversation with him. And then after that, we had that main conversation. And then on top of that, I just kind of researched the hell out of the topic, right? So I talked to other people that are, professors and experts that know a lot about Afro-Latinidad, that know about discrimination in general, that understand the social implications of Black Lives Matter inside of the Afro-Latino community, inside of the greater African-American community. So anyway, so I kind of do all that research, and then I put it in. And so as I talk to Matthew, I contextualize everything that we talk about. And as you've heard in some of the podcasts, I kind of come in and I narrate and I explain. Sometimes I explain technical terms, if that's what we're talking about. Sometimes I explain the social implications of things that we're talking about. So it became a conversation that kind of touches on different points, and that we allow it to kind of breathe normally, and that we can explain a lot of different things at length and clearly to a general audience.
Thank you. Odalis, what about you? I'd love to get some insights into how you go about deciding who's on Hello Latino.
Man, it is what Adriana said. Every story matters completely, and especially when your mission is to give Latinos, your community, a space where they can feel heard and seen, right? Like, you want them all to feel heard and seen. I think when it goes, so the first couple episodes, I was very proactive. I was very intentional. I wanted to capture in the documented experience. I wanted to capture, Latinidad, like the Afro-Latino experience. I wanted to capture these different aspects, machismo culture, like all these different topics that I thought were really heavy in the community and were needing to be addressed. And then a very beautiful thing happened when I got to a certain point. It all became referral based. Oh, I want my friend who represents this, I want them to be on it. And then from that first 10 episodes, I haven't done any outreach since, because all those people have been referring other people that they know needs to tell their story. And that's the beautiful thing about, again, giving that liberty to the person to just spill the frijoles, just put it all on the table, get vulnerable, get real, just get deep. And so when you give people that chance, they're like, wow, so I could just like talk, about like what's going on. I'm like, yes, like this is literally cafecito and chisme type of vibes. Like you do not have to be scripted. I don't ever over prepare for any of my interviews. I just kind of like have these general questions as a guide, and then that guides the rest of the interview. But yeah, it's a very like authentic conversation. So I think people are more inclined when it's that kind of like space, that kind of vibe. Everyone wants to get vulnerable. Everyone wants a chance to tell their story. And so yeah, it's been very beautiful where I haven't had to do as much proactive outreach when it comes to who I have on my pod. It's been beautiful because everyone has different circles of people. So I have people in Miami and New York. I have people who I've literally never met before. And I'm like, it feels like we've been friends our entire life. And that's just a Latino, like, buena vibras, But I think it's organic in the sense that these stories, all of them are different. Although there are similarities and it's beautiful, every story is very different. And we capture these different nuances in every story, whether it's, again, the undocumented experience or experiencing life in, being low income in Brooklyn and being raised by a single mother, or being an immigrant yourself at 10 years old and trying to navigate life. Like everyone's stories, although very similar in certain aspects, it's very different. And I think, in a very organic way, we're capturing these different narratives, these different people who represent different places in Latin America, whether they're Dominican, whether they're Hondureños, Mexicans, or, from any place in Latin America, they're representing their people, their community. And so, yeah, it's been very, very, very organic in that sense.
Yeah, I think you bring up a phenomenal point, especially on the concept of intersectionality and how about describing the Latinx identity, because as we all know, the Latinx identity is incredibly diverse. People are coming from countless intersections, whether it be the undocumented experience mixed with, let's say, Afro-Latinidad, maybe socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity. There's so many nuances and complexities to being Latinx, which is just, phenomenal to capture. One of my favorite things to do, especially with executives on Adelante, is to debunk misconceptions of what being an executive looks like, because the term professionalism means something so to the Latino executives that I speak to. So I just think that that's just a really beautiful thing to address, is, that those intersections. That being said, so as we mentioned, it's, the Latinx identity is a very diverse entity. So Adriana, I'd love your thoughts. Why is it important in your perspective to showcase the Latinx identity when, when storytelling?
I think when storytelling, it's important to showcase our identity because we're very diverse within the community, right? But we have different journeys. And I just re-interviewed for the second time. I interviewed him for the first time, Richie Serna. He's the founder and CEO, co-founder and CEO of Phoenix Payment. When I interviewed him like 2.5 years ago, he was going to some of his first interviews for VC funding, right? And he is now in Series C. I think he's at $96 million that he's been able to raise. He had zero when we interviewed. So I just interviewed him. But one of the things that we talked about was about the fact that his journey as a founder was very different from that of his, even his co-founder, who's non-Latino, but is very different. And we all have different challenges. We bring different assets to the table. And I think understanding that as people get to know us and as we share our story, as we put together those pitch decks, let's say you're pitching an idea, people need to understand where you come from and why you understand the community that you plan to serve. I think that's an advantage on our end. So highlighting our identity, highlighting the fact that we have leaders that can be role models, can help us get to higher levels is also really important, because I think something that our community needs to do more of is we need to build social capital. So if we know that there are all these Latinos in VCs or all these founders and all these techies that are working now at different companies, we're able to kind of pull each other up as a community. So for me, I think you need to have that qualifier. You need to have that identity. once again, when you share it through that perspective, the story, even though it might be similar to someone else from a different culture, it's still a bit different. We had the immigrant backgrounds. We have, the familia, because sometimes we make sacrifices for familias, and sometimes familia holds us back. So one of the things that I'm seeing a lot too for the Latinx founders and Latinx techies that I'm interviewing is that, we've all dealt with a lot of different trauma in our lives. And when you get to a professional level where you're able to process that trauma, it really, sometimes those become mental blocks that we need to get past in order to be able to be successful. So having that identity up front and center is extremely important. But I have to say that I do highlight allies as well. So I've had non-Latinx people that are part of the podcast, because of the fact that we need allies that are coming from other backgrounds to be able to become our champions and our sponsors as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, snaps, and you which is great.
Michael, can I give
you.
a shout out? Can I give a shout out to someone that I just saw? Hugo Castellano, who was one of my guests. He's here, and I'm seeing some of our guests that have been there. So big shout out, because he has conexiones as well, and he's awesome too.
Yep. Yep, we have a lot of great podcasters that are coming. I've seen a couple in the comment section as well. So shout out to everybody on this call that owns a podcast. It's not just us. So please, if you own a show, drop your link in the comment section so we can all see it. Hugo, you as well, calling you out there. If you can do that, that'd be great. So while people are doing that, Odalis, I'd love to shift to you. So you mentioned earlier that capturing different identities, especially intersectionality, and for example, the Afro-Latinidad experience is really important. So I'd love to pose a question to you. So how do you capture intersectionality on your podcast when you're sourcing for people's stories?
At the beginning, it was, again, very intentional, right? With my first couple of episodes, I wanted to specific narratives, and I guess topics, not like narratives, but cover specific topics that were, again, heavy on the community, that a lot of people experience, whether it's machismo culture, whether it's the undocumented experience, or being Afro-Latina, or even people who are first gens who don't feel like they belong in Latino spaces. That's something that happens too. And so I was very intentional with that. And I was very much in like digging into my circle and my like outer circle. And then after those initial 10, now it's been connections of connections. It's been their referrals. And so I think the way I capture it is different in terms of, because I don't source these stories, right? They kind of just come in very beautiful ways. And the way that I do every single episode is I started off with, how do you identify and why? Because I saw someone comment this and I was like, oh, snaps. It said Latinidad is the very definition of intersectionality. So true. And I've had about 17, 18 guests now, and no guest has answered that question the same. And so that shows that there's so much. I mean, even thinking about the word Latino, Latina, Latinidad, it's so complex. And it goes back to our complex histories, our complex ancestry, our complex colonization, like all of those things that, again, make Latinos very, very complex. Y más, when we come to this country, or when our parents come to this country, it adds a different layer, right? What it means to be a US citizen, or what it means to be American, right? And so it's like our identities are very complex, but the way I capture that intersectionality is really by asking that question, because you get to know the person on a deeper level. Some people say, I don't even identify as Latino. I identify as Cuban American. Or they identify as human. I've had someone say that before. So like everyone identifies differently for many reasons. And it's a very beautiful way to start that podcast, because it sets the tone for the rest of the episode, right? Because identity is something we all struggle with. I know I personally have. I know a lot of people have. And even from those first 18 episodes, I can tell it's something that is on our community's minds all the time.
Thank you, Dalis. So I'd love to stay on the topic of intersectionality, because it's really pivotal, and we've seen it in the comment section. We've talked about it a little. And as Hugo mentioned, our identities really come that experience to capture that as best we can. So, a question on mainstream media: how has Latinx people in mainstream media evolved over recent years? Do you feel toward acknowledging the subtle intersections such as Afro-Latinx, or do you think still a lot of work needs to be done there to move towards intersectionality?
Work to be done. It's crazy, and I'd really say that really only in the last 2 or 3 years have even the idea that there are subsections within the Latinidad pierced the general media landscape. And by general media, I will even put in, the larger Latino Spanish-speaking organizations. I think, all of us grew up watching Univision, maybe a little bit of Telemundo, and I really didn't see a lot of diversity in those places. I think a lot of us know that. We know that it's just like, like I mentioned before in the story that we're going to come up with this weekend, you just don't see Black people or really dark-skinned people in Univision. What does that mean? It means that there's something going on there, right? So the lack of acceptance even within the Latin community that there's a diversity of experiences and all that, like Odalis mentioned the Hondureños, it's extremely important if you have a major media organization like Univision based in Miami, that it doesn't just focus on the larger Cuban community that is in Miami, right? We need to talk more about the Hondureños, all the people in Latin America. It's so interesting, and I just don't see that. So when we're talking about even our own media has not really acknowledged that, it kind of gives you a sense of where the rest of the American media is. There was a really interesting thing that happened 2 weeks ago when the LA Times, there's been a lot of internal stress inside of the LA Times from minority reporters there and editors. And they forced the LA Times to acknowledge the racism inside of that institution. And there was an apology from the executive editor in an opinion piece about how racist the coverage had been. This is in LA, right? The LA Times in California, where the focus of the reporting, not only was it not focused on the Latino community, even though Latinos constitute more than 40% of the population of California, but the actual focus of the stories was actively racist. So what happened after that is that a lot of Latino reporters and editors started looking around at some of this has been happening, but this was kind of like a micro moment in the last 2 months. A lot of reporters were looking at who was working for some of these major media companies, and this other reporter, I can't remember his name, but they looked at all the people that work for the New Yorker magazine, right? The New Yorker is, the class of journalism, and it's been around for over 100 years. And they saw that they had a few articles about Latinos and a few reporters over the last 20 or 30 years. And what is the population of New York itself, of the state and the city? It's 20, 30, 35, almost 40% Latino too. And the New Yorker, the class journalism organization for magazines, had 0 Latinos on staff, 0. So and then the New York Times, the paper, reported on it, and then they called the New Yorker and they said, can you give us a comment? They asked David Remnick, the executive editor of the New Yorker, can you give us a comment about why there's absolutely no coverage and there's no reporters from for Latinos? Just forget about Afro-Latinidad, Asian Latinidad, anything. They have nothing anywhere. So Remnick and everybody else, they had no comment. So they should, maybe why? Because they were probably embarrassed to even acknowledge that it was that bad. So this is only 2 weeks ago, right? So when we're talking about moving forward and putting our names out there and bringing our stories to light. There's so much work to do, but that's why we do the work, and that's why it's such an exciting time to be here now, to be in podcasting, to be, I'm a reporter too, so I'm still doing writing. It's extremely important to have our stories be told as part of the fabric of this country and of the greater world, because we are here and we're not going anywhere, and people are going to listen to us, and that's a very exciting place to be.
Snaps, 100%. Yeah, as we know, stories are, we need to have representation, and we can't be what we can't see, and in our case with our podcast here, so it's really important. So that being said, and Jose, I'd love to just stay on you real quick, if that's okay. Given what you just shared, what stories do you feel need to be highlighted right now with everything that's going on in today's world, with the election, with the social unrest, the different social issues that we're wrestling with right now? What stories need to be highlighted?
My God, I mean, there's so many. I would say the health aspect of it is extremely important. As we know, all of us have been following the pandemic due to the coronavirus, and the Black and brown essential services workers have by far been the most affected, right? They're the ones, our people are the ones that are out at our Safeways and Lucky's and grocery stores, at the Costco's. They're the ones that are pulling the fruit from their roots in California, right? 80 to 85% of all fruits and vegetables that feed this country are being pulled by brown hands, right? And yet, do we find that sort of story? We find it in some places. It's totally being ignored, of course, in the places that they don't want to think about that. But those are the ones that needs to come across. We need to be in more places where those stories are known. And so the health aspect is extremely important. The immigration and the historical aspect of immigration, I think, needs to be covered. The way that, even again, going back to the mainstream organizations, the way that they cover immigration, it's as if it's been happening only for the last 20 or 25 years. Well, hello, it's been happening the whole time that this country has been around, right? Like I have family that my grandmother's mom was brought here as a baby pre-1900 to Berkeley, California, right? So my family's been, like, one tiny bit of my family has been here for 120 years, and yet also I have family in Mexico. So there's so many things that people need to know about what immigration is, how it affects taxes in this country. Imagine if everybody in this country knew how much money immigrants bring to the greater economy of the United States. If they really understood that and took it to heart through important stories, will they have room left in their heart for a lot of the hate that you're getting, right? If they really knew that that money is helping them pay for the healthcare and the education of their children, and they really understand that it's people from San Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, Costa Rica, Brazil, all of these places, will they see the issues of immigration in a different light? So those are just two: health and immigration. Of course, there's so many others, but like all of the others, there's not enough coverage, and we need to get it to them.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate that insight. Odalis, I'd love to switch to you. Hello Latino, I'm really curious, how has your podcast been received? Noticing with
Oh man, it's so beautiful. I think with every episode, unintentionally, there's a lot of healing in it. Because the thing about that I've noticed throughout Latino culture, and I've noticed it in my own family, I've noticed it in every episode, every conversation that I've had, there's a saying that at least my family always said. I don't know if anyone can relate to it, but La ropa sucia se lava en casa. You know, all your stuff that happens with you, if you're going through a hard time, you don't tell anyone, you keep that to yourself. You don't talk about any of the problems happening. And it causes all of this to kind of just stay, and we act really, and we move forward, and we know how to work through it. But what happens is that we keep all these struggles to ourselves. And although it motivates us and it fuels us to keep going, to be those ambitious, it's the Latino hustle, you know, it's that Latino immigration mentality, like, let's go, let's go, let's go, you know, like, never stop. But what happens in this episode, or in these episodes that I've had, it's a time to pause and just reflect on these things we haven't really reflected on before. And every time I have these conversations, at the end, they're like, wow, I haven't talked about that in a long time, or I've never talked about that, or thank you for asking me those questions that, I just got it all out of my system. So it's a lot of healing that's happening with my guests and with me, but the way that it's been received, it's the same thing. So when people, reach out to me, DM me, message me, whatever it is that they contact me through, they say thank you, because I feel heard, I feel seen. I also went through depression in machismo culture, and it was difficult because of XYZ. Or I also am undocumented, and it's great to see someone talk about that. Or I'm also, born and raised in Colombia, and wherever you're from, and I also came to this country. So everyone feels like they see themselves, they hear themselves, they have that representation. And that's been the goal of my podcast from the very beginning. And to feel like people who are listening, like, that's how I measure impact. It's people who are telling me even their stories, and like, whether they're on the pod or not, they're just like opening up to me, and I'm like, yes, like, healing, all of that. Like, and that's what our community needs. We don't have spaces to heal. We don't have spaces to dig deep in our own traumas and our own, we're talking about mental health in the chat. That's something that our community doesn't have access to, because it's not something our community ever addresses. And so that's how it's been received, with a lot of love, open arms, a lot of healing, a lot of people, even who aren't Latino. I had a message the other day from a Samoan American, first generation, and she was like, girl, I never listen to podcasts because I never feel myself represented. And I feel myself represented in yours, even though I'm not Latina. And that is the most powerful statement. I'm like, girl, like, thank you, like, thank you for telling me this story. And she ended up telling me this whole thing that she's gone through. And so again, it's our community, underrepresented communities. We don't have spaces where we can really tell our story. And going back to Jose, your point, like, when you see the media, it's the same story every time. If you see a Latino story, it's probably about narcos, it's probably about drug cartel, all these like similar narratives where it's like, God, you're like, Dios mío, like, there's so much more to Latinidad, there's so much more to our country, there's so much more to us. And so that's how it's been received, with a lot of love, a lot of healing. And yeah.
Just to connect with that, sorry, Michael, just wanted to follow up on that with the narcos thing. It's like, when you think about the media, it is important to think about, I think we're dealing with nonfiction podcasts, and I think it's really important to know, our role in being truthful and separating truth from lies, and, just the fantasy that's out there a lot. And you do hear, media also involves a lot of fictional narratives. And when you go on Netflix, I remember the last 2 years, I would go on Netflix. I'm very excited. I'm a movie freak, nerd. And I would go on there, and I was like, hey, I'm going to check out what's going on. And there was like a whole segment of just narco corrido, like Latino stories. Like, literally, like 9 out of 10 movies or documentaries on Netflix is about, the drug trade. And that's insane and really kind of disgusting. There is a time and a place to know about that, but let's get real. Let's get real, and let's improve on that.
Yeah, +1 to that. And I feel like a lot of people in the comment section resonate. So I know that we're a little over. I have one question that I'd love to pose to Adriana, and then I have one, not just you three, but everybody in the comment section as well. So would love to first and foremost ask my question. So Adriana, in terms of Latinx America, you've interviewed many people since starting. It's one of the podcasts that I've followed since I came into well, in addition to some more podcasts in terms of your podcast. What's next?
So as I mentioned, we're kicking season 4, and I put a link on the chat if you guys want to submit your story or nominate someone, or just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm adding video. I think that's extremely important nowadays. So I'm doing vidcasts with season 4. Also, I'm working on an ebook, and it's based on a lot of the stories, but I'm taking it from the mental health perspective too. I'm 3 classes away, because we all have different side hustles, right? I'm 3 classes away from completing all my work for to become a licensed clinical counselor, and I chose to do that because of the fact that we don't have as many mental health providers in our community that understand people like us. So I'll be integrating a special series on mental health in season 4. I'm also very fortunate to be working with strategic partners like Techqueria, the Capor Center, and other organizations that I value and that we should all be joining. So strategic partnerships is something else that I'm working on, but little by little, it's growing. I'm really excited to share that we're going to be releasing a special series in partnership with VMware for the Latinx pod, and that's going to come out next week. And it was one of those things where someone was listening to the podcast and they're like, oh, how can we do something similar? And we brainstorm, and I've been working with Ingrid Morales from VMware to get this done at VMware. So strategic partnerships and just elevating our community, because I now have over 100 episodes that we launched. I'm also working on doing the Spanish portion, because I started doing both bilingual Spanish and English, and now I've been focusing a lot on English. And I brought an intern in from the University of New Mexico, and she's going to be working with me on making sure that we also capture the Spanish stories. So growing.
Thank you so much. So I know that we're about 6 minutes from very much in all of the conversations. Thank you to you 3. I'd love to pose a question to everyone, not just, but also that are listening to this session. Thinking about podcast, the Latin nationality, how you're feeling right now after this session. If you can drop us a quick word in the comment section, what's one word? How are you feeling right now after this session? What's next for you? I'd also, to my panelists, would love to ask you that same question as well. After today's session, how are you feeling? What's one word that you would use to describe? Put it up. So
inspired, and if you want to get into podcasting, hit us up. And someone put it in the chat, but if you go to our podcast and listen and do a review on Apple Podcasts for us, that will really, really help us a lot. So if you want to do that, but inspired and empowered. And I thank you for giving us this platform to share our stories. And we hope that we're doing right by our community by doing what we do.
Yeah, I would say I'm motivated. I am so motivated to keep amplifying our voices, amplifying our stories that need to be told. People from different countries in Latin America, people from different walks of life, capturing that intersectionality. Yeah, I'm just motivated. I'm motivated to keep amplifying our voices. They need to be heard.
I'd say I'm emocionado. I'm excited to continue doing this, and part of the reason why I got into building my own company to start a podcast is to be able to be super excited about the things that I'm doing. And every time I get up and I get to work on stories that matter, that are useful to people, and that people will find inspirational in some way, is a day that is worthwhile and awesome. So I'm just happy and grateful to be here, and I'm excited to hear from everybody. Let's continue our stories, and let's continue empowering each other and moving forward.
And
Thank
let's
you.
connect
And then,
because Latinos need to stick together.
Yeah.
yep, I was about to say that. Let's all stay, drop, and it well as if you love our the world to all of us. So please, 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 is honored stage with all of you. So Odalis, Adriana, Jose, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you all are extremely busy. To everybody that's still on 9 minutes past our session time, but we really do appreciate every single one of you, and we look forward to their content. To everybody listening, to the panelists, thank you so much. And there's going to be some performance at the end of day 3, and I hope you all have a great rest of the Techqueria Summit.